Hi, I'm Jeff. This is Tropical Plants at 53 degrees north. So, have you ever had an orchid that has grown fewer blooms than last year? Well, I have. I've had lots actually, but this one is all about a Dendrobium Nobile that had less blooms this year, slightly more last year, and even more when I bought it the year previously. So what's going on? Well, there are loads and loads of videos on the internet all about Dendrobium Nobiles, and even I have one that's done particularly well despite it having not exactly duff information in there, but not a great deal to go on. So what I'm intending to do today is to update this video, update that information, and hopefully bring a little bit more to the table and try and figure out what's going on with my particular Dendrobium Nobile and why it seems to be getting worse. So let's jump in. And we are in. Okay, so just before we have a look at the Dendrobium Nobiles and have a chat about that, I want to show you this. This is a Hippeastrum. It's always nice to show something a little bit different. So this is Hippeastrum sumatra. I'm just going to bring it up to the camera here. Now this is my first attempt at growing one of the Hippeastrums from the spider group. It's not completely open yet. I expect by the end of today, because it's a glorious day today, that it will be looking much better than it looks at the moment, but it still looks pretty good to me. What do you think about that? That's nice, isn't it? Now that does show you, or this proves to you, that you can actually play around with Hippeastrum's dormancy period, because obviously we are now in the middle of April, and usually, certainly in the UK anyway, Hippeastrums are normally only coming into bloom over the winter. They're seen as like a winter flowering bulb. So what I've done with this is I've purposely brought it into bloom at this time of year just to give me a little bit more to go on in April. So isn't that gorgeous? And I've got another one coming up soon. I'm after species of Hippeastrum if I can get hold of them, but unfortunately so far I've drawn a blank. So if anybody knows where I can get hold of Hippeastrum species, that will be very welcome. So let's get on to Dendrobium Nobiles. Okay, so this is my Dendrobium Nobile. Not a great deal to look at the moment. No blooms on it. It's just lost its last bloom. But this is a plant that I bought 3 years ago, and I bought it from a place called B&Q, which is a DIY chain of stores in the UK. And they have them on sale with all the Phalaenopsis. So it's a very, very popular orchid. And as I pointed out earlier, there are loads and loads of videos on these types of orchids on the internet, on YouTube specifically. So what I want to do is hopefully bring something a little bit different to the table. Now, first of all, I'm not the expert. I don't think there is an expert on Dendrobium Nobiles unless you happen to be growing them en masse. I'm telling you what I've learnt about them and where my current thinking is in my environment. So that always goes without saying, or it should do, but I'm going to point it out anyway. This is just my take on it, my opinion on it. Okay, so also called the noble dendrobium or the rock orchid, which should give you a little bit of an idea about where the species grows. It's always really useful to look about where the species grows in the wild, because that gives you more of an indication of how you should be growing it in your environment. So the noble orchid, the rock orchid. Nobile is Latin, it means noble. That doesn't take a great leap of understanding, and it comes from areas in Asia, southern China specifically, as one of the main areas for the species, and it grows at elevations around 1,000 meters and above in the deciduous forests, which is also a clue which we'll come back to in a second, and on rocky outcrops, which is another clue which we'll come back to in a minute. It's been used in Chinese medicine for centuries, and apparently it's very toxic if you eat it, which kind of doesn't make sense, but I guess they mean if you sit down to a meal of Dendrobium Nobile, then it's not going to be particularly good for you. But they've used it for a long, long time for stomach complaints, and I believe that scientists have actually managed to separate out a compound from Dendrobium Nobile, and it has anti-cancer properties, anti-tumour properties specifically. So it is a very useful plant aside from being very decorative. This tends to be one that people think is a nice easy plant to grow because of its popularity, and of course it's always sold alongside Phalaenopsis. However, there are some specific requirements that it has that you might find, especially if you live in a temperate climate or one like I do here in the UK, you might find it tricky to give it exactly what it needs. And I have a few theories as to why mine seems to be getting slightly worse each year, and that's what we're going to discuss in a second. I'm going to take you off the tripod tripod and we'll have a close look at what's going on with this plant, have a look at what's going on in the pot, and hopefully I'm going to bring something slightly new to the table, certainly for me anyway. It might not be for everybody, but it's going to be new to me and new to my understanding of how to get these to grow really well. So let's get on to the next bit. Okay, so let's just have a quick description of my plant. So we have 1, 2, 3 and a couple of smaller pseudo bulbs or canes which have no leaves on them, so they're going to be the older ones. And it's worth looking at the size of the canes there, because I think the first one that kind of arrived with me was this great big massive one. So obviously the larger the canes, the more healthy the plant. So as time has gone on, they've got smaller and smaller. The current canes, the ones with just a few leaves on, are in the process of losing leaves. They're not bad sizes, but they're not as big as that original one, are they? It still remains to be seen what will happen to these new ones down here. So obviously it is growing some new canes. Things are looking okay in that respect, but here we have a keiki growing. Now, dendrobiums are prone to keikis, and it doesn't absolutely mean that there's a problem. However, it could do. So when a Dendrobium Nobile does produce a keiki, it could be that there's an issue, that it's not happy over something. It might just be that it decided to produce a keiki. It's just one of those things that you've got to take as an indication. And when we look inside the pot, first thing we notice is that it looks very, very kind of finely chopped, maybe even rotted down. Maybe it's gone a little bit acidic. However, if you look there, you can see green roots, so it's not totally unhappy. So that's kind of an indication of where I'm going with this. I think the pot might be a problem, but we're going to have a look inside that properly and see. But if we just talk about some of the care, then hopefully we will get to the point where I'll be able to explain what the new little bit of information is that I've managed to come up with anyway. As I say, you probably know this, or you might know it, but we'll see as we talk about this. So what happened to it this year? Well, over the winter months, I gave it its kind of much touted winter rest. And the way I deal with a winter rest is that I kind of look really closely at the plant and see what happens naturally. So as things begin to change here and our days get shorter and it gets a lot colder outside, then naturally this plant isn't growing, it's not doing anything, and I let it dry out. So when we get to that point, it's just like a natural progression. I'm not going to keep watering it if the pot is going to remain wet. So what you've got to do really is really look closely at your plant, see what it's doing. If you can see it's not growing, if you can see there are no new kind of nubbins forming, it's beginning to drop leaves and so on, then that is the plant telling you that it's ready for a winter rest. And over that period of winter rest, just keep an eye on the canes, make sure that they don't shrivel too much. Providing they don't shrivel, then really you can forget about it and don't do anything to it until you start to see new growth and new nubbings begin to form. By the way, I believe that these canes, you can cut them off, but really if you can see that there are still places where the nodes haven't flowered from, then it could still flower, it could still bloom from those nodes. So it's best to leave them on really just for the sake of having a better plant, a better specimen plant. Having said that, if they're in your way, chop them off. It's entirely up to you. You're not going to hurt it too much. So that's the winter rest taken care of. I did that perfectly well this year, followed that, no problem. When it came round to early springtime, I had several of the nodes beginning to form buds, and that's when I began to water it and slowly increase the water as those buds began to form. And then guess what? Disaster struck. These things are an absolute slug magnet, and that was what happened to mine, and that's one of the reasons why mine has only had 2 blooms on it this year. So okay, that's not really my culture, that's not the care requirements that I'm providing for it. That's just what happens in a greenhouse when you're outside. You get lots of slugs. I do my best to try and keep on top of them, but for some reason they're really, really attracted to these soft-leaved Dendrobium Nobile types. I have another Dendrobium Nobile, and I know that that's where the slugs head. And the first thing that they go to is, surprisingly, not the leaves, it's actually the buds and the blooms. That's what they seem to like to eat, those waxy blooms and those waxy buds. So that's what happened to mine. So you would say, well, okay, it's not doing too badly. It certainly isn't blooming as much as it did right at the beginning. So how come the very first lot of blooms that you get when you buy it from B&Q or wherever you bought it from, supermarket, how come they cover the whole cane? How come it's like the absolute perfect mass blooming? Well, of course, because they're grown in perfect conditions. These things are produced en masse, just like Phalaenopsis, in great big giant warehouses where everything is computer controlled, all the conditions are computer controlled. I could only replicate that if I was only to focus on the one plant. And of course, as you know, in here I grow all sorts of plants with all slightly different requirements. So that's not something I know I can replicate. In terms of other care requirements, I think I've done a pretty good job, but I still think there's something that maybe is out of my control, and that is the light. So when we talk about optimal conditions for growing a Dendrobium nobile, you've got to look at what the species do. And the species in southern China, which a lot of these hybrids and cultivars, and this is a no ID one by the way, a lot of these hybrids and cultivars were originally hybridized from, they live either epiphytically up in the trees or lithophytically growing on rocky, mossy limestone outcrops. Okay, so that tells you that the roots really need to be well drained. Now, is this well drained, I ask? Well, first of all, because I did this a couple of years ago, I didn't really know what I was doing at that point. Well, I didn't know what I was doing at all. It's all definitely a process of learning. So I didn't put any extra holes in the pot. I don't think, and when I'm looking at this now, I don't think there is enough air in there. I think that is like a really tightly packed, just really the typical temperate gardener, that's the way we pot things. We like to stuff those roots in, and we like to make sure those roots are surrounded by something, and of course they don't really like to be. A little caveat there, because I understand that no less than Kew Gardens actually grow the Dendrobium nobile species in very, very tight pots. They say they like to be tight. So we'll come back to what Kew do in a minute, because that's something that obviously has got to have a bearing on what I'm going to do with mine. So I'll carry on with care requirements. Humidity over 50%. Now again, that's not something that I can control very often, because in the cooler side of my greenhouse, I'm not really going to spend £300, £400, £500 on another humidifier, bearing in mind that it's humid in there for 90% of the year. It's actually, as I speak, it's not actually rained for about a month, which is really unusual for April. April's normally known for the showers. Oh, we've got a little visitor. Hello, Fudge. Hello. Want to say hello to everybody? Get that ear the right way round. It's always turning inside out. Do you have a dog with inside out ears? Hello, little boy. Hello. I'm sure he won't get up to anything while I'm doing this. Just keep going, plod on. So the light. So the light is something that is new to me in terms of what I've recently found out. So these grow, the species grow in deciduous forests. So what does that tell you?